Imagine a quiet neighborhood in Sacramento, California in the late 1980s. The residents of F Street had always considered their elderly neighbor, Dorothea Puente, as a kind hearted landlady who took in those who had nowhere else to go. However, the serene facade of her boarding house masked a gruesome secret. In November 1988, police made a chilling discovery: seven bodies buried in Puente's yard. The sweet, grandmotherly figure was hiding a monstrous reality. How did Dorothea Puente transform from a caretaker to a cold blooded killer? What drove her to commit such heinous acts, and how did she manage to evade suspicion for so long? Today, we dive deep into the dark and twisted story of Dorothea Puente, the deaf house landlady. To understand the horrors that unfolded at 1426 F Street, we must first delve into the life of Dorothea Puente. Born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9th, 1929, in Redlands, California, her early life was fraught with instability and trauma. She was one of seven children, and her parents were both alcoholics. By the time she was 10, both her parents had died, leaving her and her siblings to fend for themselves. This tumultuous childhood set the stage for a life marked by deception and crime. As a young adult, Puente dabbled in various criminal activities, including forging checks and running a brothel. She married several times, each relationship ending in turmoil and further fueling her descent into a life of deceit. Despite her criminal past, Puente managed to reinvent herself as a seemingly benevolent caregiver in the 1980s, opening a boarding house for elderly and mentally disabled individuals. However, beneath this veneer of compassion lay a sinister motive: greed. Puente's boarding house, located at 1426 F Street, became a magnet for society's most vulnerable. Her tenants included elderly individuals and those struggling with mental illness or addiction. Puente would gain their trust, and once they were firmly ensconced in her home, she would methodically kill them. Her modus operandi involved drugging her victims with sleeping pills, suffocating them, and then burying their bodies in her yard. She would continue to collect their social security checks, forging their signatures and pocketing the money. The community initially saw her as a pillar of support, a woman who provided care to those in need. It wasn't until a social worker reported a tenant missing that suspicions began to arise. When the police started investigating, they were met with Puente's charm and seemingly cooperative demeanor. However, the investigation took a dark turn when they dug up the yard and discovered the bodies. The shockwaves of this discovery reverberated through the community, turning Puente's home into a house of horrors in the public eye. How did she manage to keep up this facade for so long? Why did the community fail to see the signs? Join us as we unravel the mystery of Dorothea Puente, the woman who turned her boarding house into a death trap, and learn about the tragic fate of her unsuspecting victims. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9th, 1929, in Redlands, California. Her early life was anything but stable. She was the sixth of seven children in a household marred by dysfunction and neglect. Her parents, Trudy and Jesse James Gray, were both alcoholics, and their turbulent lifestyle left deep scars on young Dorothea. By the time she was 8, her father had passed away from tuberculosis, and a year later, her mother died in a motorcycle accident. This left Dorothea and her siblings orphaned, bouncing around in foster homes. The instability and trauma of her early years had a profound impact on Dorothea's psyche. She was known to fabricate stories about her childhood, often claiming to be the youngest of 18 children born to a Mexican and Native American family. These fabrications were perhaps a way to cope with her troubled past, creating an alternate reality that was less painful than the truth. As she grew older, Dorothea's life took a darker turn. In 1945, at the age of 16, she married Fred McFall, a soldier returning from World War II. This marriage ended in divorce after just a few years, during which time she had two daughters, both of whom she gave up for adoption. She then moved to San Francisco, where she became involved in various criminal activities, including check fraud and running a brothel. Her brushes with the law led to several arrests and short stints in jail. In the 1960s, Dorothea began to reinvent herself. She married several more times, each marriage ending in either divorce or her husband's death under suspicious circumstances. Despite these personal failures, she managed to cultivate an image of a respectable woman dedicated to helping those in need. This image was bolstered by her work as a nurse's aide and her eventual transition to running boarding houses. Psychologically, Dorothea exhibited traits often associated with sociopathy. She was highly manipulative, capable of gaining the trust of those around her while hiding her true intentions. Her ability to lie convincingly and her lack of remorse for her actions suggest a deep seated psychological disorder. Some experts believe that her traumatic childhood and subsequent instability could have contributed to her development of these sociopathic tendencies. Dorothea's motivations were primarily financial. She saw an opportunity to exploit the vulnerable for monetary gain, showing a complete disregard for human life. Her charming demeanor and seemingly genuine concern for her tenants were all part of her elaborate facade. This duality in her personality made her a particularly dangerous individual, capable of horrific crimes while maintaining an outward appearance of a caring landlady. Understanding Dorothea Puente's early life and psychological makeup is crucial in comprehending how she became the notorious death house landlady. Her troubled past, combined with her manipulative nature and greed, set the stage for the gruesome crimes that would later shock the nation. Dorothea Puente's boarding house, located at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California, appeared to be a sanctuary for the elderly and disabled. The modest Victorian home was a two-story building with a white exterior and a welcoming front porch, giving off an aura of warmth and safety. Inside, Puente meticulously maintained the home, creating an environment that felt cozy and inviting. She decorated it with antique furniture, floral prints, and family photos, all adding to the illusion of a nurturing space. Puente's tenants were among society's most vulnerable: elderly individuals, people with mental disabilities, and those battling addiction. She offered them a place to stay when they had nowhere else to go, promising care and stability. The rent was often paid through social security checks, which Puente insisted on managing herself. She assured her tenants and their families that this was for their benefit, to help them budget and ensure their needs were met. The operations of the boarding house were seemingly straightforward. Puente provided meals, managed medications, and handled daily chores, all while maintaining strict rules. Tenants were not allowed to have visitors without her permission, and she often monitored their comings and goings closely. This control extended to their finances, as she would collect their mail, including social security checks, which she claimed were used to cover their expenses. Despite the outward appearance of care and order, there were early signs that something was amiss. Neighbors noticed a high turnover rate among tenants, with people moving in and out frequently. Puente often explained this away, saying that the tenants had found other places to live or had reunited with their families. However, suspicions grew as the smell of decay occasionally wafted from the property, and her explanations for the frequent digging in the yard became less convincing. Some tenants also began to disappear without any notice. One such tenant, Bert Montoya, a mentally disabled man, was reported missing by his social worker in 1988. When the social worker inquired about Montoya's whereabouts, Puente claimed he had left to visit family in Mexico. This excuse was not satisfactory, leading the social worker to contact the authorities. The police initially took Puente at her word, as she had cultivated an image of a kind and helpful landlady. However, as they delved deeper, Inconsistencies in her stories and the increasing number of missing tenants raised red flags. Neighbors reported seeing tenants who seemed ill or drugged shortly before they disappeared, and there were whispers of Puente's controlling behavior and the strict rules she imposed. The growing unease culminated in a police visit to the boarding house in November 1988. When they arrived to question Puente about the missing tenants, they were struck by the overwhelming odor of decay. Upon searching the property, they discovered the first of several bodies buried in the yard. This horrifying discovery shattered the facade Puente had so carefully constructed, revealing the true extent of her cruelty and greed. The boarding house, once a symbol of refuge, was now a scene of one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in American history. The early suspicions and signs of trouble had been there all along, but it took the dedicated efforts of law enforcement and concerned individuals to uncover the truth about Dorothea Puente and her deadly boarding house. Dorothea Puente's boarding house on F Street in Sacramento became the final resting place for many vulnerable individuals. Her victims were carefully chosen from among the elderly, mentally disabled, and those struggling with addiction. These were people who had fallen through the cracks of society, making them easy targets for Puente's heinous crimes. One of her earliest known victims was Ruth Monroe, a 61-year-old woman who moved into Puente's boarding house in April 1982. Monroe had recently lost her husband and was struggling to cope. She saw Puente as a friend and a source of support. However, shortly after moving in, Monroe was found dead from an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. Puente claimed that Monroe had been depressed and had taken her own life, a story that the police initially believed. Another victim, Everson Gilmeth, was an elderly man whom Puente had met through a pen pal program for prisoners. After his release, he moved in with Puente, and they even began a romantic relationship. Puente continued to cash his pension checks even after he mysteriously disappeared. His body was later discovered in a homemade coffin buried on the bank of the Sacramento River. Bert Montoya, a mentally disabled man, was perhaps the most pivotal victim in uncovering Puente's crimes. Montoya's social worker became suspicious when he suddenly disappeared, prompting an investigation that ultimately led to the discovery of the bodies in Puente's yard. Puente's modus operandi was both cunning and cold-blooded. She would gain the trust of her tenants, often appearing kind and caring. Once they were under her control, she would isolate them from the outside world, cutting off their communication with friends and family. Puente would drug her victims, often with sleeping pills or other sedatives, rendering them incapacitated. She would then suffocate them, either by smothering them with pillows or by other means. To cover up her crimes, Puente buried the bodies in her yard, meticulously planting bushes and other plants over the graves to hide any signs of disturbance. She continued to collect her victims' social security checks, forging their signatures and keeping the money for herself. Her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to manipulate those around her allowed her to evade suspicion for years. The discovery of Puente's crimes began with the disappearance of Bert Montoya. His social worker, concerned for his well-being, repeatedly visited the boarding house demanding to see Montoya. Puente provided various excuses, claiming that Montoya had gone to Mexico to visit family. Unsatisfied with these explanations, the social worker reported Montoya missing to the authorities. When the police arrived at Puente's home to investigate, they were greeted with her usual charm and cooperation. However, the overpowering smell of decay from the yard raised immediate red flags. When asked for permission to dig in her yard, Puente agreed, likely believing they would not find anything immediately incriminating. As the police began to dig, they uncovered the first body. Shocked and horrified, they continued their search, ultimately finding 7 bodies buried on the property. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of the gruesome reality of Puente's boarding house. The victims were in various states of decomposition, each wrapped in cloth or plastic. The police investigation quickly turned into a media frenzy, with reporters dubbing Puente the death house landlady. The neighborhood, once considered quiet and safe, became the focal point of a chilling serial murder case. As the bodies were identified, families of the victims were contacted, each revelation bringing more grief and horror to light. Puente was arrested but managed to flee briefly before being captured in Los Angeles. During her trial, the prosecution laid out a damning case, detailing how she had systematically murdered her tenants to collect their social security checks. The defense tried to paint Puente as a caring woman who had simply become overwhelmed by her responsibilities, but the evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies of former tenants who had managed to escape her clutches were particularly damning. They described how Puente had drugged them, isolated them, and made them fear for their lives. Medical experts provided evidence of the drugs found in the victims' systems, further corroborating the prosecution's case. In 1993, Dorothea Puente was convicted of 3 murders, with the jury deadlocked on several other charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Puente's calm demeanor throughout the trial, even as the gruesome details of her crimes were laid bare, left a lasting impression on those who followed the case. The discovery of Puente's crimes had a profound impact on the community and law enforcement practices. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of the elderly and disabled, prompting changes in how such boarding houses were monitored and regulated. Puente's house on F Street, once a place of refuge, became a symbol of betrayal and horror, a grim reminder of the evil that can lurk behind the most benign of facades. The investigation into Dorothea Puente's crimes began in earnest with the disappearance of Bert Montoya, a mentally disabled tenant whose social worker grew suspicious after he vanished without a trace. The social worker's persistence led the authorities to Puente's boarding house on F Street in November 1988. What initially seemed like a routine welfare check quickly escalated into a full-scale investigation when police noticed the overwhelming smell of decay in the yard. Authorities began piecing together the evidence with methodical precision. When they received permission to dig in Puente's yard, they were unprepared for the horrors they would uncover. The first body they found was a turning point, prompting a thorough search of the entire property. Over the next few days, police uncovered a total of 7 bodies, each buried in shallow graves and at various stages of decomposition. The grim discovery turned the quiet neighborhood into a media circus, with reporters and curious onlookers flocking to the scene. As the investigation progressed, the police compiled a mountain of evidence against Puente. They found numerous items belonging to the victims inside her home, including identification cards, personal belongings, and social security documents. Additionally, toxicology reports revealed that the victims had been drugged with sedatives, supporting the theory that Puente had incapacitated them before killing them. The authorities also discovered that Puente had been cashing the victims' social security checks, which provided a clear financial motive for the murders. During the trial, which began in 1992, the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see the outcome of the case against the so-called death house landlady. The prosecution presented a compelling case, detailing how Puente had systematically targeted vulnerable individuals, gained their trust, and then murdered them to collect their social security benefits. The evidence included the physical remains of the victims, toxicology reports, and testimony from former tenants who had narrowly escaped Puente's deadly scheme. One of the key moments in the trial came when former tenants took the stand to recount their harrowing experiences living under Puente's roof. They described how she had drugged them, controlled their finances, and made them live in constant fear. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of Puente's manipulative and ruthless nature. Medical experts also testified, confirming the presence of sedatives in the victims' systems and explaining how the drugs could have incapacitated them. Puente's defense team attempted to portray her as a benevolent caregiver who had become overwhelmed by her responsibilities. They argued that the deaths were accidental and that Puente had no malicious intent. However, the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution made it clear that these were not accidents but premeditated murders. The trial also featured dramatic moments, such as when prosecutors played recordings of Puente's interactions with the police and potential tenants, showcasing her manipulative skills and deceptive charm. The jury was shown graphic photographs of the exhumed bodies, driving home the gruesome reality of the crimes. The prosecution's narrative was compelling, a seemingly kind landlady who preyed on the most vulnerable members of society for financial gain. After a lengthy trial, the jury found Dorothea Puente guilty of 3 counts of first degree murder. Despite being charged with 9 murders, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on all counts, leading to a mistrial on 6 of the charges. Nevertheless, Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed little emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout the trial. Dorothea Puente's conviction brought a sense of closure to the families of her victims, but the case left a lasting impact on the community and law enforcement practices. It highlighted the need for better monitoring and regulation of boarding houses and raised awareness about the vulnerabilities of the elderly and disabled. Puente spent the rest of her life in prison, dying in 2011 at the age of 82. Her case remains one of the most notorious examples of elder abuse and serial murder in American history, a chilling reminder of the evil that can hide behind a seemingly benign exterior. The aftermath of Dorothea Puente's crimes sent shockwaves through the Sacramento community and beyond. Residents who once believed their neighborhood to be safe and serene were suddenly confronted with the horrifying reality that a serial killer had been living among them. The discovery of multiple bodies in Puente's yard led to a sense of betrayal and fear as neighbors grappled with the idea that they had been so thoroughly deceived by someone who appeared so harmless. In response to Puente's crimes, significant changes were implemented in law enforcement practices and social services. Authorities realized the need for stricter oversight and regulation of boarding houses, particularly those serving vulnerable populations such as the elderly and mentally disabled. Social workers and law enforcement agencies began to collaborate more closely, ensuring that reports of missing individuals or suspected abuse were taken seriously and investigated promptly. These changes aimed to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Puente's legacy is a dark and infamous one cemented in the annals of true crime history. Her story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television shows, all attempting to unravel the mystery of how a seemingly benign grandmotherly figure could commit such heinous acts. The media portrayal of Puente often focuses on the stark contrast between her outward appearance and the horrific nature of her crimes, highlighting the theme of hidden evil. One notable portrayal was the episode of American Justice titled Death House Landlady, which delved into the details of her life and crimes, providing a comprehensive overview of the investigation and trial. Additionally, Puente's case has been featured on popular true crime shows like Forensic Files and Deadly Women, further cementing her place in the public's morbid fascination with serial killers. In summary, Dorothea Puente's story is a chilling reminder of how appearances can be deceiving. Born into a life of instability and trauma, she developed manipulative and sociopathic tendencies that would later enable her to commit a series of brutal murders. Operating under the guise of a caring landlady, Puente preyed on society's most vulnerable, drugging and killing her tenants to steal their social security checks. Her ability to deceive those around her, including law enforcement, allowed her to carry out her crimes for years before being caught. The investigation into her crimes was meticulous, involving the discovery of bodies in her yard and the gathering of extensive evidence that ultimately led to her conviction. The trial was marked by dramatic testimonies and overwhelming evidence that painted a clear picture of her guilt. Sentenced to life in prison without parole, Puente remained a figure of fascination and horror until her death in 2011. Reflecting on this case, it becomes clear that greater vigilance is needed to protect vulnerable populations. Improved oversight of boarding houses and closer collaboration between social services and law enforcement are essential steps in preventing similar tragedies. Additionally, raising public awareness about the signs of elder abuse and exploitation can help communities identify and stop potential predators before they can do harm. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and crimes of Dorothea Puente. If you found this video informative and engaging, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know if there are other true crime stories you'd like us to cover. Stay safe and always be aware of your surroundings.